In the late summer of 2017, the Cascade Mountains of Washington state were preparing for their seasonal shift. The long, warm days that drew hikers and climbers by the thousands were beginning to shorten, and a crispness in the alpine air hinted at the coming autumn. It was into this majestic and unforgiving landscape that twin brothers, Liam and Noah Vance, planned to make one last significant trek before the school year began. At 24 years old, the Vance twins were the picture of responsible, adventurous youth. They were both graduate students at the University of Washington, Liam studying structural engineering and Noah pursuing a doctorate in environmental science. Their shared love for the outdoors was a bond forged in childhood, a passion inherited from their father, a geologist who had taken them on their first camping trips before they could properly walk. They were not novices. They were seasoned, knowledgeable, and meticulously prepared individuals who respected the power of the wilderness. The plan was for a 5-day loop through a notoriously challenging but rewarding section of the Alpine Lakes wilderness, a region east of Seattle characterized by jagged granite peaks, high-altitude lakes, and dense, primeval forests. They had submitted their itinerary to their mother, Sarah Vance, a retired nurse living in Seattle. The document was detailed, listing their intended campsites for each of the 4 nights, contingency routes in case of bad weather, and a firm return date. They were scheduled to exit the trailhead on the afternoon of Tuesday, September 5th, and be back at their shared apartment in Seattle by evening. Sarah recalled in later testimony that the plan was so thoroughly conceived, it read more like a professional expedition proposal than a casual hiking plan between 2 brothers. This was their way. They left nothing to chance. On the morning of Friday, September 1st, the brothers made their final preparations. Their last confirmed sighting was at a small general store in the town of North Bend, the last significant outpost of civilization before the mountain passes. The store owner, a man who had seen generations of hikers pass through, remembered them clearly. He described 2 young men, physically identical with the same sandy brown hair and steady blue eyes, moving with a quiet confidence. They purchased a few last-minute items, extra fuel for their camp stove, a bag of salted almonds, and 2 bars of dark chocolate. They were cheerful, relaxed, and spoke of their excitement for the views from a particular ridge they hoped to reach by the 2nd day. The owner noted their gear was top of the line and well-maintained. At approximately 8:15 a.m., they paid in cash, wished him a good weekend, and drove east in their dark green pickup truck. A final text message was sent from Liam's phone to their mother at 8:47 a.m., a simple, at the trailhead. "All good. Love you," accompanied by a photo of a wooden sign marking the entrance to the trail. The signal was lost moments later as they entered the deep valley. Tuesday, September 5th, came and went. Sarah Vance, accustomed to the boys' punctuality, felt the first prickle of unease when her evening phone call went unanswered. She told herself it was nothing. A flat tire, heavy traffic coming back from the mountains, a celebratory meal that had run long. By Wednesday morning, when calls to both of their phones went directly to voicemail, and they failed to check in as promised, the unease curdled into a cold, specific dread. Liam was scheduled to TA a freshman engineering seminar that morning. Noah had a critical meeting with his dissertation advisor. Neither of them showed up. Their friends, initially unconcerned, began a chain of calls and texts that eventually led back to Sarah. The shared certainty that something was profoundly wrong solidified in a matter of hours. At 11:30 a.m. on Wednesday, September 6th, Sarah Vance walked into the King County Sheriff's Office precinct in Snoqualmie and officially reported her 2 sons missing. The official response was immediate and by the book. The case was assigned to Detective Miles Corbin, a veteran officer with 2 decades of experience, many of them spent working with the county's Search and Rescue (SAR) division. Corbin was a quiet, methodical man who understood the dual nature of the Cascades, their breathtaking beauty and their utter indifference to human life. The first step was to confirm the starting point. A deputy was dispatched to the trailhead specified in the brothers' itinerary. At 2:10 p.m., the deputy located their dark green pickup truck, parked neatly in a designated spot. The vehicle was locked and undisturbed. A quick look through the windows revealed a scene that was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. A pair of city shoes sat on the passenger floor mat, a half-empty bottle of water was in the center console, and a campus parking permit hung from the rearview mirror. Everything appeared exactly as one would expect for a vehicle left for a multi-day trip. The absence of any sign of struggle or disarray suggested the brothers had started their hike as planned. But it also meant that whatever had happened to them had happened out there in the vast, green wilderness. By late afternoon on September 6th, a full-scale search operation was mobilized. The initial command post was established in the parking lot where the Vance brothers' truck sat like a silent monument. King County Search and Rescue, a volunteer-driven organization of highly skilled mountaineers, climbers, and trackers, formed the core of the ground operation. They were supported by deputies from the sheriff's office, rangers from the U.S. Forest Service, and, as the sun began to set, the distinctive thumping of a helicopter from the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, equipped with a forward-looking infrared FLIR camera, began to echo through the valleys. Detective Corbin reviewed the brothers' detailed itinerary, a document that now felt less like a plan and more like a map into a mystery. The first 24 hours of any wilderness search are the most critical, and the clock was already well past that point. The primary objective was to saturate the brothers' planned route, a 35-mile loop known for its steep elevation changes and exposed ridges. The search process was a painstaking and methodical grid-by-grid effort. Ground teams, typically in groups of 4 or 5, were inserted by helicopter at key points along the planned route to search both towards and away from the trailhead. They moved slowly, their eyes scanning the dense undergrowth, the labyrinthine rock fields, and the steep, tree-choked ravines that flanked the trail. The terrain was brutal. What appeared on a map as a simple line was in reality a path that climbed thousands of feet over loose scree, descended into damp, mossy forest where visibility was limited to a few yards, and crossed swift, glacially fed streams. The dense forest canopy proved to be a significant challenge, rendering aerial observation from helicopters and drones largely ineffective for spotting a person on the ground. The FLIR camera, so effective in open country, was defeated by the thick blanket of evergreen foliage. Canine units were deployed early in the search. 2 types of dogs were used: tracking dogs, which rely on a specific scent article, and air scent dogs, which search for any human scent in a given area. A shirt taken from the brothers' apartment was used to give the tracking dogs a scent profile. One of the handlers reported a promising start. His dog, a bloodhound named Bess, picked up a clear trail leading from the Vance truck and onto the main path. The dog followed the scent confidently for approximately 3 miles, a journey that would have taken the brothers a little over an hour. Then, at a point where the dirt trail crossed a wide, flat expanse of granite slab rock, the trail went cold. The dog circled the area, whining in frustration, but could not reacquire the scent. It was as if the brothers had simply vanished into the air. The handlers speculated that they might have taken a break on the sun-warmed rock, allowing the wind and heat to disperse their scent, or perhaps they had waded through a nearby creek, a classic tactic for intentionally breaking a trail. But why would they do that? As the days passed, the search expanded, growing more desperate. By the end of the first week, over 200 personnel were involved. Volunteers from the local hiking community, friends of the family, and students from the university joined the official teams, combing through designated zones under the supervision of SAR leaders. The search area had expanded from the primary trail to encompass a 50-square-mile quadrant of some of the most rugged terrain in the state. Every day, the teams would return to the command post at dusk, their faces etched with exhaustion and disappointment. They found traces of other hikers, a discarded granola bar wrapper, a forgotten trekking pole, but of Liam and Noah Vance, there was nothing. Not a footprint in a muddy patch, not a broken branch, not a single piece of discarded gear. It was this complete lack of evidence that was most unnerving for the seasoned searchers. Accidents, they knew, almost always left a sign, a slide mark, a dropped pack, a piece of brightly colored clothing. The wilderness was messy. The disappearance of the Vance brothers was unervingly clean. One puzzling clue emerged on the 5th day of the search. A team traversing a steep, off-trail ridge about 2 miles east of the brothers' planned route found a single, neatly folded wool sock placed carefully on a flat rock. It was a dark gray, high-quality hiking sock, identical to the brand Sarah Vance confirmed her sons wore. It was clean, dry, and showed no signs of having been exposed to the elements for long. There was no corresponding sock, no boot, no footprint, no other sign of human passage anywhere in the vicinity. The placement seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial. Search leaders were baffled. Was it a signal? A prank? A breadcrumb left by one of the brothers? Or was it, as some feared, a deliberate piece of misdirection left by someone else? The sock was carefully bagged and sent for forensic analysis, but it yielded no answers. It was just a sock, sitting where it had no logical reason to be. After 10 days of intensive, round-the-clock searching, the official operation began to scale back. It was a difficult but necessary decision, driven by the grim calculus of resource management and statistical probability. The weather was turning, with the first autumn storms rolling in from the Pacific, bringing rain and low clouds that grounded the helicopters. The volunteer numbers dwindled as people had to return to their jobs and lives. The vast majority of surviving victims in wilderness incidents are found within the first 72 hours. After more than a week with no new leads, the likelihood of finding Liam and Noah alive was plummeting. The official classification of the operation shifted from active rescue to limited, continuous search, and then, finally, to recovery. The command post was dismantled, and the forest fell silent once more. For the official record, the case of the Vance brothers remained open, but it was now a cold case. For Sarah Vance, the scaling back of the official search was not an end, but a new, terrible beginning. She refused to accept the wilderness had simply swallowed her sons. She liquidated her retirement savings, using the funds to hire private search teams, specialist trackers with dogs, and independent helicopter pilots. For months, she maintained a presence near the trailhead, coordinating efforts from a rented RV that became a de facto headquarters for what she called the Vance Family Search. She and a rotating group of dedicated volunteers, many of them friends of Liam and Noah, continued to push into the backcountry, following up on a psychic's vague vision or a hiker's half-remembered sighting of two men who might have been her sons. They papered every town in the Cascade foothills with missing person flyers, the boys' smiling faces juxtaposed with the stark, bold letters of the word missing. The first year passed. The vibrant green of the forest turned to the gold and red of autumn, then to the stark white of a deep winter, and back to green again. Each change of season brought a fresh wave of grief and a renewed, desperate hope for Sarah. Winter was the hardest. The heavy snowpack, sometimes reaching depths of 20 feet in the high country, entombed the mountains, making any further search impossible. It felt, she said, like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the spring thaw. She spent those months poring over maps, reading accident reports, and becoming an expert in the geography and climatology of the region that held her sons captive. She learned the names of every peak, every basin, every forgotten miner's trail. As time stretched from months into years, public perception of the case began to shift. The initial outpouring of sympathy and support slowly gave way to speculation and unfounded theories. Stories circulated on internet forums. Perhaps the brothers had staged their own disappearance to escape debts or some hidden trouble. One particularly persistent and painful rumor suggested a voluntary escape to start a new life, off the grid. These theories were poison to Sarah, twisting the knife of her uncertainty. She knew her sons. They were responsible, loving, and deeply connected to their lives and futures. They would not have done this. They could not have. The investigation, now officially in the hands of the Cold Case Unit, explored these possibilities with due diligence, examining the brothers' financials, their social media, their personal emails. They found nothing. No secret lives, no hidden troubles, just two well-adjusted young men with bright futures who had one day walked into the mountains and never returned. 3 years after the disappearance, a new theory gained traction, briefly reigniting media interest. A freelance journalist published a long-form article suggesting that Liam and Noah had stumbled upon a clandestine drug operation hidden deep in the national forest. The article pointed to several major narcotics busts in the general region in the years following the disappearance as circumstantial evidence. This theory, while more plausible to the public than the idea of a voluntary disappearance, offered no comfort to Sarah. It simply replaced the indifferent cruelty of nature with the calculated cruelty of man. Detective Corbin, now nearing retirement but still personally invested in the case, quietly investigated the claim. He interviewed informants and cross-referenced timelines, but found no credible link. The drug operations were miles from the brothers' planned route and operated in different seasons. It was another dead end. By the 5th anniversary of the disappearance, the case had faded from the public consciousness, becoming another piece of grim local folklore. The missing person flyers were sun-bleached and peeling, their faces staring out from community notice boards like ghosts from a forgotten time. The official search was a distant memory. For the King County Sheriff's Office, the Vance case was one of dozens of unsolved disappearances in the vast wilderness areas under their jurisdiction. But for Sarah Vance, time had not healed. It had only sharpened the edges of her loss. She had sold her house in Seattle to continue funding her private search efforts, now scaled back to a few focused expeditions each summer. Her hope was no longer a blazing fire but a stubborn, glowing ember. She was no longer searching for 2 living sons. In the quiet solitude of her new, smaller apartment, filled with maps and case files, she admitted to herself she was searching for their remains, for an answer that would allow her to finally bring them home. On October 12, 2022, nearly 5 years and 6 weeks after Liam and Noah Vance disappeared, a man stumbled out of the dense forest onto a remote logging road deep in the mountains of Skagit County, more than 70 miles north of the original search area. He was emaciated, his skin was pale and translucent, and his feet were bare and bloody. He was wearing what appeared to be the tattered remains of a simple, hand-sewn tunic made of rough, undyed wool. But the most striking thing about him was his hair. It was snow white, every strand drained of pigment, a stark contrast to the youthful, unlined face beneath it. He flagged down a logging truck, the driver a man who had spent 30 years working in these isolated woods and thought he had seen everything. The man in the road did not speak. He simply pointed back towards the woods, then collapsed onto the gravel shoulder. The driver, using his satellite phone, called 911. The man was transported to a hospital in Sedro-Woolley. He was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from profound vitamin D deficiency, suggesting a long period with no exposure to sunlight. His body was a roadmap of healed and partially healed injuries, ligature marks on his wrists and ankles that had scarred over, a constellation of small, circular scars on his back, and evidence of multiple poorly set bone fractures in his hands and feet. He carried no identification and, for the first 24 hours, remained mute, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed to see past the sterile hospital room and into some private, ongoing horror. The Skagit County Sheriff's Office ran his fingerprints through the state database. The first set of prints came back with no match. Confused, the technician ran them again. On the second attempt, a partial match was flagged in the system, linked to a set of juvenile prints taken for a summer camp ID card 16 years earlier. The system cross-referenced the partial match with a missing persons file. The name that came back was Liam Vance. The discovery sent a shockwave through the law enforcement community and the Pacific Northwest. A man, missing and presumed dead for 5 years, had reappeared. Detective Miles Corbin, just 3 months from his planned retirement, drove the 2 hours north to the hospital in Skagit County. He entered the hospital room and saw the man who was once the sandy-haired, athletic 24-year-old from the missing person poster. The man lying in the bed was gaunt and frail, and the shock of white hair was deeply disorienting. But the eyes, though filled with a haunted emptiness, were the same steady blue. Corbin sat by the bed for an hour, not speaking, simply being a calm presence. Finally, the man's gaze focused on him. His voice, when it came, was a dry, rasping whisper, the sound of vocal cords long and used. He asked 2 questions. "Is my mother okay?" And then, after a long, shuddering breath, "Did you find Noah?" The case of the missing Vance brothers was instantly reclassified. It was no longer a cold case, no longer a search and recovery mission. It was now an active kidnapping and homicide investigation. A multi-agency task force was formed, led by Detective Corbin and including agents from the FBI, who brought with them their significant resources for forensic analysis and behavioral profiling. The hospital room became a protected space, with deputies posted outside. The primary, and for now only, witness was the victim himself, a man whose mind and body had been subjected to unimaginable trauma. The first interviews were conducted by a forensic psychologist, who worked to build a rapport with Liam and help him access his memories without causing further psychological damage. The story he began to tell, in fragmented and disjointed pieces over the course of several days, was more horrifying than any of the internet theories or journalistic speculations had ever imagined. According to Liam's testimony, their first day on the trail had been perfectly normal. They had made good time, covering nearly 8 miles and setting up their first camp by a small alpine lake. They were experienced and efficient and felt completely at home. The morning of the second day, they were packing up their camp when a man emerged from the trees. He was dressed in buckskin and furs, looking like a figure from another century. He carried a long rifle and moved with a preternatural silence. Liam recalled that there was nothing overtly threatening about him at first. He spoke to them in a calm, almost academic tone, asking about their route and their gear. He seemed knowledgeable about the wilderness, and they fell into a conversation about local flora and fauna. The man offered them some smoked jerky, which they politely declined. It was then that the encounter shifted. The man's eyes, which Liam described as empty and flat, like a doll's eyes, settled on them. The man stated, not asked, that they would be coming with him. When they refused, he raised the rifle. It was not a modern firearm, but an old, powerful-looking muzzleloader. The first shot was not aimed at them. It was aimed at their tent, a single, deafening blast that tore a hole the size of a fist through the fabric. The message was clear. The man forced them to hike away from the trail, moving north into ever more remote and difficult terrain. He made them carry their own packs for the first day, but then, at a designated spot, he had them empty their packs of all modern equipment. Their nylon tent, their gas stove, their GPS device, their synthetic sleeping bags, all of it was left in a pile. In its place, he gave them crude, heavy gear he retrieved from a hidden cache, oilskin tarps, heavy wool blankets, and cast iron pots. He was systematically stripping them of their 21st century identities and remaking them in his own primitive image. He spoke very little during the 2-day forced march. When he did, it was to issue commands or to lecture them on what he called the sickness of the modern world and the purity of a life of true self-reliance. He referred to them not by their names, but as the control group, or the subjects. Their destination was a place that did not exist on any map. It was a small, hidden valley, accessible only through a narrow crevice in a rock wall that was concealed by a waterfall. Within this hidden sanctuary, the man had built a compound. It was not a simple cabin, but a small, self-sufficient homestead, complete with a log house, a blacksmith's forge, a smokehouse, and terraced gardens. There was a pen that held several goats and chickens. It was clear that this was not a temporary camp. It was a permanent, hidden world, the product of years, perhaps decades, of labor. Here, their captivity began in earnest. The man, whom they learned was named Elias Thorne, subjected them to a bizarre and cruel 5-year experiment. His goal, he explained in his detached, clinical monologues, was to study the resilience of the human animal, stripped of all modern comforts. He was particularly fascinated by their bond as identical twins, wanting to see if their connection would endure or break under extreme, prolonged duress. The first stage of his experiment involved breaking them physically. They were put to work, performing hard labor from sunrise to sunset, felling trees with axes, quarrying stone for a new wall, tending the gardens. Their diet was meager, consisting mostly of boiled potatoes, goat milk, and whatever edible roots they were taught to forage. Any mistake or moment of defiance was punished swiftly and dispassionately. The punishments were not born of anger, but of a chilling sense of scientific correction. A dropped tool might result in being chained to a post overnight in the freezing cold. A failure to gather enough firewood meant no food for 2 days. The circular scars on Liam's back were from a pain compliance study, where Elias would press heated metal discs to their skin to measure their vocal and physiological responses. The psychological torture was even more insidious. Elias would play them against each other, offering one brother a slightly larger portion of food and then observing their interaction. He would separate them for weeks at a time, keeping one in the main cabin while the other was confined to a small, dark-root cellar, and then document any changes in their behavior when they were reunited. He kept meticulous notes in a series of leather-bound journals, his handwriting a neat, precise script. Liam recalled seeing him spend hours every night by candlelight, writing down his observations about their weight loss, their skin pallor, their sleep patterns, and their conversations, which he sometimes monitored from a hidden peephole. He was a scientist, and they were his lab rats. Noah, the environmental scientist, initially tried to engage with Elias on an intellectual level. He tried to understand his philosophy, to debate his anti-modernist views. For a time, it seemed to work. Elias seemed to enjoy the intellectual jousting, and Noah became a sort of favored subject. But this phase ended abruptly about 2 years into their captivity. Noah, weakened by malnutrition and a persistent lung infection, had begun to openly defy Elias, refusing to work. His defiance was not aggressive. It was a quiet, stubborn resistance. Elias saw this not as a sign of spirit, but as a failure of the specimen to adapt. One evening, Elias announced that Noah's data set was complete. He led Noah away from the main cabin towards a part of the valley they had never been allowed to explore. Liam never saw his brother again. When he asked Elias what had happened, the man replied with cold finality that Noah had been archived. For the next 3 years, Liam was alone with his captor. The grief and the guilt of surviving his brother were a constant, crushing weight. Elias's experiments became more focused on a single subject. He seemed to be studying the effects of extreme isolation and grief. He would talk to Liam for hours about Noah, asking him to recall specific memories, all while taking detailed notes. It was during this period of intense psychological torment that Liam's hair began to change. It started with a few white strands at his temples and then, over the course of a single year, spread until every hair on his head was drained of color. He saw his reflection once in a pail of water and did not recognize the gaunt, white-haired old man staring back at him. His escape was not a feat of daring or strength, but an accident. A rare, powerful windstorm swept through the region, toppling a massive, ancient cedar tree. The tree fell across the narrow canyon that housed Elias's compound, its massive root ball tearing a new, temporary opening in the rock wall on the far side of the valley, a side Elias had always forbidden him from approaching. Elias was occupied for days, assessing the damage to his property and salvaging wood from the fallen giant. In a moment of inattention, while Elias was on the roof of the cabin repairing a section of damaged shingles, Liam saw his chance. He ran. He scrambled over the fallen tree, through the new opening, and into the unfamiliar forest beyond. He ran for 2 days, with no food, no water, and no sense of direction, fueled only by adrenaline and the terror of being recaptured. He did not stop until he stumbled upon the logging road. Liam's harrowing testimony provided the task force with a wealth of information. He was able to describe the layout of Elias's compound in detail, including the location of the hidden entrance behind the waterfall. He recalled specific geographic features from the forced march 5 years earlier, a uniquely shaped rock formation, a river that bent in a particular way. Using Liam's memories and advanced satellite imagery analysis, the team began to narrow down the search area. The location in Skagit County where Liam had emerged was the new center of the map. They were no longer searching the vast Alpine Lakes wilderness, but a more focused, 100-square-mile patch of rugged, inaccessible land between the Skagit and Sauk rivers. The description of Elias Thorne, his appearance, his skills, his philosophy, was fed into the FBI's behavioral analysis unit. They began building a profile, a white male, likely in his late 50s or 60s, with a possible background in engineering, forestry, or the military. He was highly intelligent, physically fit, and a paranoid recluse with a god complex. He was what profilers call an organized, non-social offender. He did not kill for passion or pleasure, but for a twisted, pseudo-intellectual purpose. While the search for the compound was underway, forensic teams went over Liam's body with a level of detail usually reserved for a crime scene. The small, circular scars on his back were examined under a microscope. Metallurgists analyzed microscopic traces of metal left in the scar tissue, identifying a specific alloy of brass commonly used in antique scientific instruments. The poorly healed fractures in his hands were X-rayed, and an orthopedic surgeon determined they were consistent with being repeatedly slammed in a door or crushed with a heavy, flat object. The ligature marks on his wrists were so deep and old that they had permanently damaged the underlying tissue. Most compellingly, fibers found embedded in his tattered woolen tunic were analyzed. They were not from a sheep, but from a specific breed of mountain goat native to the region, suggesting the wool had been hand-harvested, spun, and woven. Every detail of Liam's physical state corroborated his incredible story. The breakthrough in identifying Elias Thorne came from an unexpected source: the Washington State Department of Natural Resources Archives. Based on the profile, an FBI analyst began a painstaking search for individuals who had filed for permits to build or live in remote areas and had subsequently dropped off the grid. She was looking for someone with an anti-government or extremist philosophical bent. After weeks of cross-referencing land use permits, tax records, and old voting registrations, she found a name: Elias Thorne. In 1982, a man by that name, a former Army Corps of Engineers officer with a genius-level IQ, had purchased a 200-acre parcel of remote, inaccessible land. He had filed a series of rambling, philosophical manifestos along with his building permits, railing against industrial society and declaring his intention to create a new Eden. He was denied several permits for non-compliance with environmental regulations. After a brief legal battle, he had vanished. He stopped paying taxes, his driver's license expired, and he effectively ceased to exist in the official world. The location of his land parcel was exactly in the center of the task force's refined search grid. With a suspect identified and a probable location, the task force began planning the apprehension. This was not a simple arrest. Elias Thorne was a highly skilled survivalist, likely armed, and on his home turf. His compound was a fortress. A direct, overt assault was deemed too risky. It could give him time to destroy evidence, or worse, lead to a violent, prolonged standoff. The decision was made to use a covert surveillance and insertion strategy. A team of highly trained FBI hostage rescue team, HRT, operators, specialists in rural and wilderness tactics, was brought in. For 3 days, they used high-altitude, near-silent drones to conduct thermal and photographic surveillance of the area, confirming the existence of the compound just as Liam had described it. They identified the waterfall concealing the entrance and mapped the heat signatures from the cabin and the forge. They observed a single figure moving around the compound, a tall, lean man with a long gray beard. The operation was scheduled for the pre-dawn hours of November 2nd. 2 6-man HRT teams were to be inserted by helicopter several miles away and move in on foot under the cover of darkness. One team would secure the perimeter of the hidden valley, while the other would make the final approach to the cabin. Detective Corbin and a small team of investigators would be with the perimeter team, ready to move in once the site was secure. The plan was executed with military precision. The teams navigated the treacherous terrain in complete radio silence, their night vision goggles turning the dark forest into a world of green light. By 4:30 a.m., they were in position. The entry team located the waterfall and, just as Liam had described, found the narrow crevice hidden behind the curtain of water. They moved through it, emerging into the small, secret world of Elias Thorne. The compound was silent. A thin tendril of smoke rose from the chimney of the log cabin. The team moved with practiced stealth, surrounding the structure. Using a fiber-optic camera slipped under the door, they saw Elias Thorne asleep in a simple wooden bed, his long rifle leaning against the wall beside him. The decision was made for a dynamic entry. At 5 a.m. precisely, a small explosive charge breached the door, and the team flooded into the cabin, their shouts of "FBI! Get down!" shattering the pre-dawn quiet. Elias Thorne was awake in an instant, his hand reaching for the rifle. But he was too slow. Before he could raise it, he was tackled and subdued, the fight over in seconds. He did not struggle or shout. As the agents secured him in restraints, he looked at them with the same calm, detached curiosity he had once turned on the Vance brothers. His eyes met those of the team leader, and he spoke his first words. "The experiment is contaminated," he said, his voice a gravelly monotone. "The results will be inadmissible." With Elias Thorne in custody, Detective Corbin and his team entered the compound. The scene was even more disturbing than Liam's testimony had prepared them for. The cabin was obsessively organized, more like a laboratory than a home. On a large wooden desk sat the leather-bound journals, dozens of them, filled with Elias's meticulous, chilling observations of his captives. The forge contained not just tools for farming, but manacles and chains. The smokehouse had hooks that were clearly designed for more than curing meat. It was a factory of dehumanization. The most crucial part of the investigation was now to find what had happened to Noah Vance. Based on Liam's account of Elias's words, they began a search of the area where Noah had last been seen. They brought in a team of forensic anthropologists and cadaver dogs. The dogs quickly alerted to a section of ground near a small, separate structure that appeared to be a makeshift library or study. Underneath a stone flag floor inside the study, the investigators found a small, dry cellar. In the cellar, they found Noah. Elias had not killed him, at least not in the conventional sense. He had archived him. Noah's remains had been preserved through a crude, self-taught mummification process, using salt and dry air from the cellar. He was laid out on a wooden plank, his body wrapped in linen, his face peaceful. Next to him, on a small shelf carved into the dirt wall, was a final, sealed journal. This one was titled Specimen B. Terminal Phase. It contained Elias's detached, scientific account of Noah's final days, his slow decline from the lung infection, and his quiet, defiant death. For Elias, it was not a murder. It was the conclusion of a data set. The discovery of Noah's body was the final, horrific piece of the puzzle. During his interrogation, Elias Thorne showed no remorse. He was cooperative, but only in the way a professor might explain his life's work to a particularly slow student. He confirmed the details of Liam's story, often correcting minor points of fact regarding timelines or measurements. He explained his motive with a chilling, philosophical clarity. He saw modern society as a corrupting influence, a cage of comfort that was weakening the human species. His goal, he claimed, was to establish a new baseline for human potential by studying individuals in a pure state of nature. He had chosen Liam and Noah because they were healthy, intelligent, and, as twins, provided a unique opportunity to study the role of genetic and social bonds in survival. He did not see himself as a kidnapper or a murderer. He saw himself as a researcher, a pioneer, and his victims were not people, but data points. His complete and utter lack of empathy was, to the seasoned investigators, the most terrifying thing about him. The trial of Elias Thorne was a media sensation, but the proceedings themselves were swift and conclusive. The prosecution, led by the King County District Attorney's Office, built an overwhelming case. There was the physical evidence from the compound, the journals, the chains, the preserved body of Noah Vance. There was the expert testimony from doctors, forensic anthropologists, and behavioral analysts. But the heart of the trial was the testimony of Liam Vance. He took the stand, a pale, thin figure with a full head of white hair, and for 3 days he recounted his 5 years of captivity in a quiet, steady voice. He did not cry or shout. He simply told the truth. He spoke of the cold, the hunger, the pain, and the endless psychological torment. He spoke of his brother's courage and defiance in the face of their captor's monstrous science. When he was done, the courtroom was utterly silent, the jury visibly shaken. Elias Thorne, acting as his own counsel after firing several court-appointed attorneys, cross-examined Liam. His questions were not legal challenges, but bizarre philosophical queries about Liam's experience. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: 2 counts of kidnapping, 1 count of first-degree murder, and numerous lesser charges of assault and unlawful imprisonment. At his sentencing, Elias Thorne was given the opportunity to make a statement. He stood and delivered a 45-minute lecture on the failings of industrial civilization, never once mentioning his victims by name. He expressed no regret, only frustration that his research had been interrupted and his findings contaminated by the outside world. The judge, in a voice heavy with revulsion, sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 150 years. He was sent to the state's most secure penitentiary, where he would spend the rest of his days in a small concrete cell, a cage of comfort, of a sort, that he had long railed against. He died of a heart attack 7 years into his sentence, alone in his cell, his grand experiment over. The aftermath of the trial was, for Liam Vance, the beginning of a new and different kind of survival. His physical recovery was slow. It took more than a year for him to regain his strength and for his body to recover from years of malnutrition and abuse. His psychological recovery was a journey he knew would last a lifetime. He worked with therapists who specialized in severe trauma, slowly learning to live with the ghosts of his past. He could not return to his life as an engineering student. The world of formulas and certainties no longer made sense to him. He found a measure of peace not in the cities or classrooms he had once known, but in the controlled, predictable nature of a greenhouse. He took a job at a botanical garden, tending to rare orchids, finding solace in the quiet, patient work of nurturing life. His hair remained white, a permanent, physical testament to the time he had lost and the horrors he had endured. Sarah Vance finally had an answer. She had brought one son home alive and the other home for a proper burial. She established the Vance Brothers Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting the families of missing persons and providing funding for volunteer search and rescue organizations. Her pain had been forged into purpose. The case of the Vance brothers became a landmark in the annals of criminal investigation, a chilling case study in psychological endurance and the cold, detached nature of a certain kind of evil. It led to changes in how cold cases were managed and how law enforcement utilized behavioral science and technology to track individuals who had chosen to live as ghosts. For most, the story was a terrifying tale of survival in the wilderness. But for those who knew it best, it was a somber reminder that the most dangerous predators are not the ones with claws and fangs, but the ones with theories and notebooks, the ones who can look at another human being and see not a soul, but a specimen. The wilderness had not taken Liam and Noah. A monster wearing a man's face had. And one brother had returned, not to tell a story of being lost, but to bear witness to a story of being found.